So I will speak about the vocabulary of naming in Herodotus Histories. There are several passages in the histories where Herodotus show a clear interest in language. For example, we can think to the experiment conducted by the pharaoh Psammetichus to identify the first language of mankind, or to the classification of the Ionian cities according to their dialects, or even the discovery of a phonetic characteristic common to all Persian names. And on several occasions, this interest applies to things that are doubtful or controversial. For instance, Herodotus denounces the Scythian origin of the name of the Arimaspians, a people from the northern edge of Europe whose existence seems doubtful to him. Or he mocks the Hyperborean theory about a people who would live even beyond the Arimaspians towards the north, by pretending to believe in the existence of a people of Hypernautians. Or he bases his condemnation of the division of the world into 3 distinct continents on criticism of the names that have been attributed to them. Whether it provides a real argument or supports a rhetorical scheme, in these 3 examples, Herodotus' reflection on language is endowed with a real polemical value. So can this association between linguistic question and naming and polemical purpose, be observed more generally in the histories? So the vocabulary of naming in histories is particularly well represented, especially with the verbs kalēω, ォνομάζω, or the noun ōnoma. And a very frequent use in common to these to all 3 terms is to introduce a name as a predicative noun or noun phrase. So instead of giving immediately the name, Herodotus designates it as a mention by introducing it with a verb or a verb phrase. So is it a kind of precaution? And is it a way of keeping the name away? Is it used in a controversial manner? Some passages of the histories suggest so. The verbs kalēω and ォνομάζω are applied to realities that led themselves to controversy. This is the case, for instance, when Herodotus describes the signs by which the Egyptians recognized their bull god Apis. He refers to the latter by the expression, this calf called Apis. As a participle kalēomenos may be used here to express Herodotus' reluctance to admit this appellation, which makes a god of a Moschos. He uses the same participle to refer to the tomb erected by the Aeginetans at Platoiai, whose deceptions he reveals. The tomb that is called the tomb of Aeginetans, as he said, is merely a cenotaph intended to suggest to posterity that the Aeginetans participated in the glorious battle, which they did not. A similar polemical meaning can be read in the designation of a disease from which Cambyses suffers and which drives him to madness. A grievous disease, which some call sacred, namely epilepsy. This relative clause, ten hiren ονομάζω can be understood as reflecting a conception expressed by the Hippocratic author of the treatise on the sacred disease. The physician opposes the commonly accepted religious interpretation of this illness, which he sometimes refers to as herodotus kaleomene, the disease which is called sacred, expressing the same reluctance as in Herodotus. So in all three examples, the verbs kalēω and ォνομάζω are likely to express a rejection or to introduce appellation. To express a rejection or of the appellation on the part of the inquirer. However, about the passage quoted in the last example, Paul de Monts notices that Herodotus' position deviates in one essential point from the conception of the disease defended by the Hippocratic author, the involvement of the phrenes. This is the word Herodotus uses to name Cambyses' mind, which is affected by the disease at the same time as the body. Yet the author on the sacred disease vigorously rejects any link between that illness and the phrenes, to which he denies the role that the common Greek language gives them, the seat of the mind. Because of this fundamental difference, the Hippocratic parallel cannot show by itself that Herodotus condemns this designation, sacred disease. Does the relative clause ten hiren ονομάζω provide a sufficiently unambiguous clue to state this condemnation with certainty? Paul de Monts suggests another interpretation of the phrasing. It would serve here to introduce not a questionable designation, but just a second one. Indeed, he notices that the first designation of the disease in Herodotus' text, nusus megalen, also corresponds to an attested name of epilepsy. Thus, Herodotus' expression would mean not a serious disease, which some claim to be sacred, with a polemical meaning, but the Greek disease, sometimes called the sacred disease. This suggestion by Paul de Monts goes along the observation that numerous occurrences of the verbs καλέω and ονομάζω in Herodotus Histories are used to introduce names about which it seems difficult at first sight to suppose a controversy without additional clues, such as the name of a character or the name of a Nile fish. Among those occurrences that are hardly controversial are those that introduce words borrowed from a foreign language, such as the tunic of the Egyptians that they call calasiris. This last type of occurrences provides the possibility of another hypothesis. These expressions may be used as a kind of precaution on the part of the inquirer when introducing a word probably unknown to his audience. A parallel to this hypothesis can be found in the use of the participle kaleomenos in the Hippocratic treatise. Uses of this participle are the subject of a detailed study by Nathalie Rousseau. Her examination of the various occurrences of kaleomenos in the Hippocratic corpus allows her to note, first of all, that it is very hardly associated with terms that are questioned by the author of the treatise. A few occurrences introduce commonly used terms, thus constituting popular appellations, but they're not very frequent. In most cases, the term introduced by this participle is a technical one. Then she seeks to determine what motivates medical authors to introduce certain technical terms in this way. She identifies two possibilities, either to identify the term as technical or to place the author in a didactic position towards the reader and to open the way to an explanatory development about the nature of what the terms refer to. So are the verbs kaleo and ォνομάζω used by Herodotus in a way comparable to that identified by Nathalie Rousseau about kaleomenos in Hippocratic treatise? To answer this question would require a similar investigation of all occurrences in the histories. But for this paper, I conducted the investigation on a smaller corpus, the corpus of the places name of the place names, toponyms, which are mentioned in the histories. Because this is the category of words which by Herodotus is most frequently introduced by a phrasing involving kaleo or ォνομάζω or the noun όνωμα. Therefore, I surveyed the toponyms introduced by these phrasings, asking several questions. Do these phrasings provide a contesting meaning when they introduce a toponym? If so, does the dispute relate to the name or to the very existence of the designated place? And if not, what motivates the use of these phrasings? I will begin by giving a quick overview of the survey. I have concentrated for this study on toponyms only. That is to say, I excluded ethnonyms, even when the latter are used to designate the territory of the people concerned. But I have included at first adjectives derived from toponyms when applied to a noun that refers to a topographical reality, for example, gay, Corée, Limne, active, country, lake, or peninsula. Because I considered that they contribute to naming. They were contributing to naming a unique and precise geographical feature, as well as the noun would do. So this way, I identified just over 4,300 occurrences of toponyms in the text of the histories. And these toponyms are in great majority devoid of any introductory phrasing. Nevertheless, 210 occurrences are supported by a phrasing used to announce a naming. These phrases mainly involve the verb καλέω in the sense of naming, as well as the noun όνωμα. But we can also notice the occasional appearance of three other verbs that are ονομάζω, λέγω, and νομίζω. Besides this lexical aspect, they can take a variety of syntactic forms. The participial phrases is by far the most represented. 94 toponyms are introduced in this way. In the vast majority of cases, the verb καλέω is used, as here about the city of Elephantine, which Herodotus mentions at the beginning of the description of Egypt when giving a general overview of the dimensions of the country. He says, and between Thebes and the city of Elephantine, there are 1,800 stadia. Well, the city, which is called Elephantine. Two other toponyms are introduced by the noun όνωμα in the accusative of relation. This is the case of Cimmeria, a region of Scythia in whose name Herodotus identifies a remnant of the passage of the Cimmerians into Scythia. He says a region named Cimmeria. The toponyms in the histories can also be introduced by a relative clause, such are 68 of them. So these relative clauses mainly use the verb καλέω, usually in the passive forms, in the passive voice, but also on a few occasions in the active, or sometimes a verbal phrase involving όνωμα. Well, this second form is slightly more frequent than the verb καλέω. And well, for example, when Herodotus traces the route of Xerxes' troops, he reports that they pass after the city of Dariscos, not far from another polis, te onoma esti Mesembrie, a city whose name is Mesembria. And finally, some toponyms, 43 in number, are introduced by a verb or verb phrase that appears in an independent clause or its equivalent. So is the mention of the Akes that you can read here. When recounting the landscaping works inflicted by the Persians on the valley of this river, Herodotus takes the time to describe the place and says, now from this circle of mountains flows a great river, and its name is Akes. So most of the time it is a very short clause, as here, which does not fundamentally change the economy of the sentence in comparison with a relative clause. But sometimes the phrasing occupies a more important space, as when Herodotus mentions the promontory of Hippoleos in his description of the rivers of Scythia, then you can see on the screen. So as with the relative clauses, these phrasings usually include either the verb kaleo or the noun unoma. So apart from these very few toponyms, the overwhelming majority of the toponyms mentioned in the histories lacks this mentioning phrasings. So they concern only a small minority of them. Moreover, it should be also noticed that some toponyms that appear several times in Herodotus' work are alternately endowed with and devoid of these phrasings, such as the name of Greece, for example, or that of the Erythraean Sea. So on these maps, you can see, I hope that you can see it, it's maybe a little small. So in red, you have the places in the histories whose names are introduced at least once by one of these naming phrasings. And in blue, you have all the toponyms which are invariably devoid of them. You have also arrows by times, which indicate places that are located outside the boundaries of the map, because it was hard to find an adequate one. And the size of the dots is not really significant. It only serves the purpose of legibility, except for the three huge dots, which indicate the three continents. So this first overview raises some new questions, which can be added to the previous one. First, why does Herodotus take care to introduce certain toponyms rather than others, or certain occurrences of a toponym rather than others? Is it related to the nature of the place which is designated, or rather to the context of its appearance in the histories? So in this paper, I will take a closer look at the different toponyms introduced by these phrases and the context of their occurrences. By examining them, we can see that naming phrasings do not provide a controversial meaning by their own. So we will have then to consider other hypotheses to account for these phrasings, especially the hypothesis of a precaution towards the audience of the histories. The first hypothesis to account for these phrases associated with certain toponyms to the detriment of others is that of a polemical role, which they would assume in the manner of quoting marks. A first remark can be made against this hypothesis. Several toponyms corresponding to places whose existence Herodotus denies or whose status of name he disapproves of, are never introduced by these phrases. For instance, the river Ocean, whose existence he strongly contests on 2 occasions in the histories. It is also worth mentioning Asia and Europe, which is never the subject of these phrases. Even though Herodotus explicitly disavows its naming. However, these phrasings tend to come and go in an irregular way in the histories. So their occasional absence can hardly constitute a conclusive argument. And on the other hand, several toponyms introduced by these phrases refer precisely to places whose names Herodotus more or less explicitly disputes. The most striking example is the Egyptian delta. At the beginning of the Egyptian digression, Herodotus points out the decrease in its fluting and the danger that this decrease represents for the Egyptians. He says, as you can see on the screen, he spoke about the Egyptians who live below the Lake Moeris, and particularly those who inhabit what is called the delta. Yet a few lines later, Herodotus attacks the Ionian definition of Egypt, which restricts the country's territory to the delta alone, a definition that is incompatible, Herodotus retorts, with the Egyptian claim to the title of the world's oldest people, since the delta as an alluvial land is still a young territory. In his demonstration, the name of the delta appears again accompanied by a similar phrasing. The Egyptian did not come into being with at the same time as that which is called as a delta by the Ionians. There ever existed since the beginning of men, and as the land grew in extent, many of them spread down over it, and many stayed behind. I quote here the translation of Alfred Denis Godley, slightly modified. This is the only example of the history in the histories where the agent of the participle kaleomenos is expressed when it introduces a toponym. Because of this singularity, and because the problem explicitly raised in this passage is not that of the naming of the delta, but the question of Egypt's borders, editors generally agree to adopt John Enoch Powell's conjecture of adding Aegypto after Kaleomeno. So the delta, which the Ionians call Egypt. If we accept this conjecture, we can identify 2 different uses of Kaleomenos in these 2 passages. To the commonly used appellation to Kaleomenon delta, what is called the delta, Herodotus opposes the appellation proposed by the Ionians, which he rejects. So the delta the Ionians call Egypt. In the first occurrence, Kaleomenon would be used to present the toponym as a name, which is, if not popular, at least commonly shared and conventional. In the second occurrence, on the other hand, Kaleomenon, with its express agent, would be used to reject the appellation Aegyptos by keeping it at bay. This appellation would imply that the Ionians are wrong to adopt this name. Provided we follow this conjecture, we could therefore identify a polemical interplay between 2 radically different meanings of Kaleomenos. This interplay opposes the Ionians to a large and less defined group consisting of Herodotus and all this Greek audience his Greek audience capable of recognizing themselves as using the appellation delta. However, another possibility arises if we seek to make sense of the text as it is transmitted. Without the addition of Aegypto, the appellation introduced by Kaleomena and attributed to the Ionians in the second passage remains delta. The only difference from the first occurrence lies in the mention of the agent, the Ionians. If so, it must be understood that the use of the toponym delta to refer to this region of Egypt has its origin in Ionian geography. From this perspective, if an agent were to be added in the first occurrence of Tokaleomenon delta, it would also be the Ionians, but Herodotus refrains from mentioning them here because they are not his target. This target would be rather in this passage, the Egyptians themselves, because Herodotus is mischievously returning their comments on the threat of the drought weighing on the Greece. So the situation changes totally in the second passage, where Herodotus refutes the Ionian definition of Egyptian territory. This time, the mention of the Ionians fully coincides with the inquirer target. Now, after this refutation, Herodotus offers his own opinion on the borders of Egypt. I quote another time the translation of Alfred Denis Godley. Nay, we put the Ionians' opinion aside, and our own judgment concerning the matter is this. Egypt is all that country which is inhabited by Egyptians, even as Cilicia and Assyria are the countries inhabited by Cilicians and Assyrians severally. So the definition of Egypt that Herodotus gives here may seem simplistic and threatened with circularity. In fact, he is not satisfied with it. He reinforces it in the following passage by the authority of an oracle of Ammon. But the point of this first definition is to associate closely the determination of the territory with the people who occupies it. The mention of the Ionians is the preceding refutation. In the preceding refutation can be interpreted in conjunction with this astonishing counter definition. So Herodotus would seize the opportunity provided by the toponym delta of Ionian origin to reinforce a contrast for polemical purposes. The Egypt he rejects is presented as an Egypt of entirely Ionian conception. Both the definition of its territory, which does not take into account the distribution of the Egyptian population, and its denomination, which consists of a Greek word, delta, stressed by the participle kaleomenos, are imposed by Ionian geographers. In contrast, the conception defended by Herodotus is closely related to the Egyptians themselves, thanks to the insistence of the derivation process. When he says Egypt is all that country which is inhabited by Egyptians. According to this second interpretation, the second occurrence of kaleomenos helps to constitute an opposition between two groups, which this time are the Ionians on the one hand and the Egyptians and Herodotus on the other. So this distribution of forces allows Herodotus to base his refutation of the Ionian conception and the defense of his own conception of Egypt on the argument of autochthony. In Herodotus, which is a fundamental one to his eyes. The importance of this principle of autochthony in Herodotus' investigation is highlighted by Catherine Darbo-Péchanski in Le Discours du Particulier. So she explains that the reliability of a testimony is generally increased in the eyes of the inquirer if its author belongs to the people whose history or customs are being described. However, in either interpretation, it is mainly the second occurrence of the name of the delta that expresses this polemical meaning. And within this second occurrence, it is mainly the agent complement, hypotonionon, that is responsible for it. So can the participle kaleomenos alone or an equivalent phrasing alone be sufficient to express enough reluctance to endorse a contest of the name or even the existence of the place? Well, some of this phrasing are used to introduce the names of geographical realities whose existence is being disputed, and not only the naming, or at least questioned by Herodotus. The river Eridanus is a notable example. When describing the confines of Delta of Europe, after mentioning the wonders of the southern edge of the Oikoumene, Herodotus suddenly interrupts himself to speak about the Eridanus. But concerning the farthest part of Europe towards the sunset, I cannot speak with exactness, for I do not believe that there is a river called by barbarians Eridanus, issuing into a sea towards the Boreas, whence our amber is said to come, nor have I any knowledge of Cassiterides, whence our tin is brought. In this context of controversy, the use of the infinitive kaleestai rather than einai, for instance, seems intended to reinforce the polemical meaning of the disputing sentence. However, this kaleestai may be invested with another function. If we consider the rest of the passage, indeed, Herodotus explains that there is a clue revealing with evidence that this river is pure invention of the poets. Its name, Unoma, which with unmistakably Greek consonances. The use of kaleestai must therefore be seen as inseparable from the complement pros barbaron. It is not intended to increase the polemical force of the assertion, but already suggests the reason for the distrust. The attribution of the name Eridanus to the barbaric people of Europe. Thus, kaleestai allows Herodotus to set the stage for his main argument. The table of the sun, the middle in the Macrobian Ethiopian country, can also be the subject of such an analysis, but I will have to pass a little quicker on this. So even when this phrasing concern toponyms that are controversial, as the Eridanus, the delta, or the table of the sun, the polemical meaning of these phrases of mention remains very limited. The only occurrence where this interpretation is indisputable are quite particular. Either the phrasing appears with an unusual construction, which gives it more weight and expressiveness. This is the case for the Eridanus and for the first occurrence of the table of the sun, on which I couldn't give time. Or this phrasing is reinforced by additional elements. So the indications of the agent hypotonionon for the second occurrence of the delta, for instance. So these additional elements in this case are the real carriers of the polemical meanings. So these few occurrences from too fragile an argument to be able to attribute with certainty this polemical meaning to the more ambivalent occurrences, such as the first occurrence of delta or this last occurrence of the table of the sun. So when these phrases introduce toponyms about which Herodotus expresses no reluctance, for instance, the river Triton, or the city of Elephantine, or the lake Maetion, which is mostly the case, these few particular occurrences are not sufficient to invest all these phrasings with a polemical significance. So apart from a few exceptional cases, these phrases cannot therefore be explained as a distancing of the inquirer from the toponyms that they introduce. They could, on the other hand, express the consideration of another form of distance, the assumed lack of familiarity of the audience with the name of a place very far from the regions they know. This is the hypothesis that I will examine now. This use could be compared with the hypothesis examined by Nathalie Rousseau, according to which the participle kaleo would be applied above all in Hippocratic treatises to terms of technical use possibly unknown to the audience of the treatise. An equivalent hypothesis could be formulated concerning the toponyms of the histories. Those of them that concern the most remote places of Greece, from Greece and the Aegean Sea or Italy, share with the technical terms of the medical treatise the risk of being unknown to the work's target Greek or Italian audience. There would therefore be applied a similar treatment consisting in stressing them by the addition of an introductory phrase, kaleomenos, or to kaleetai, or to ονομάζω, and so on. This comparison can be based on the observation that in the histories themselves, other types of words with the same risk of misunderstanding are introduced by one of these phrases. Local appellations, for example, or terms from a foreign language. Moreover, a passage in the histories seems to play precisely with this specific use of introductory phrasing concerns with this specific use of introductory phrasings. So this passage concerns the advice addressed to Xerxes by the Spartan Demaratus after the Battle of Thermopylae. He recommends to the Persian kings to take the war directly to Sparta by establishing his fleet on the island of Kythera, which he then designates by the expression an island whose name is Kythera. If this kind of phrases is actually used to introduce the names of places that are unknown because they are far away, the island of Kythera, located in the heart of the Greek world, should not be the subject of it. However, Demaratus' speech is addressed to a different audience than that of the histories, a Persian, King Xerxes. It is to this specific audience that he tunes his speech. So it is Xerxes' assumed unfamiliarity, not that of a Greek audience, that is taken into account and suggested by the relative clause te ονομάζω applied to Kythera. Moreover, this hypothesis has the advantage of accounting, at least partially, for the sometimes intermittent nature of these phrases. Indeed, many of the toponyms introduced by these phrases also appear on their own elsewhere in the histories. If these phrases were to be interpreted as a precaution taken by the inquirer with regard to a term whose legitimacy he questions, it would be difficult to understand why this same term would be accepted without difficulty a few lines or a few chapters later. On the other hand, if these phrases are intended to introduce a toponym that is supposedly unknown to the audience, it is much easier to accept that it is then considered to be known or can occur without an introductory phrase. If not without the histories, then at least within the same development. For instance, it can be observed that the only occurrence of the name of the Euxine that is introduced by one of these phrases is the one that appears at the beginning, the very beginning of the histories, at the opening of Croesus' story. Apart from this solemn introduction, the name of the Euxine Sea is never introduced with a similar precaution. Even more striking is the example of Theria. This region is located in the north of the Anatolian Peninsula, on the bank of the Euxine Sea around the city of Sinope, at a certain distance, therefore, from Greece and the Aegean Sea. It first appears in the histories when Herodotus describes the advance of Croesus bearing war against the Persian king. For its first appearance, the region of Theria is here introduced by the participle kaleomene and immediately followed by a parenthetical remark indicating its location. On the other hand, when he mentions it again a few lines and then a few chapters later, Herodotus no longer takes any of these precautions to evoke a place that he has already presented to his audience. However, the irregularity of the introductory phrases does not always occur in this convenient way. It happens that one of them suddenly appears associated with a toponym already mentioned above without any precaution. The concept of this appearance, the context of this appearance can sometimes help to explain it. For example, when the city of Carchinitis on the southern coast of Scythia is mentioned in the overall description of the Scythian square, it is introduced by the participle kaleomene. Yet, the name of the city already appeared in the description of the Scythian rivers without any introductory phrases. However, it has not moved any further away from Greece between the two occurrences. On the other hand, the description of the Scythian square is characterized by a special attention to the audience and more precisely to his geographical knowledge. Indeed, in order to make his audience understand the specific situation of Tauric Peninsula in relation to Scythia, he offers a comparison with the situation of Kipsunion in relation to Attica, and does not stop here because he goes on with the Italian country. So he takes care of proposing a second analogy to adapt his Athenocentric explanation to an Italian audience. So it must be noted that in this very passage, he shows particularly acute awareness of his audience. This singularity may explain why this second mention of the city of Carchinitis is presented with more care than its first occurrence. However, if we consider the distribution of toponyms introduced by unoma, kaleo, or lego within Herodotus oikoumene, so if we look again to the map, we can see that they are not less numerous in Greece and the Aegean Sea than in the distant lands. So geographical distance cannot therefore be sufficient to account for the use of all these phrases. So I think that that has to be remarked is that there are another special category of phrasing, of mention phrasing that has to be remoted from this card. So it's the one which is represented on this second map. Well, which is not represented, I'm sorry. So you have a number of phrasing, of mention phrasing, which are used to support a commentary about the name from Herodotus, and especially to introduce a historical distance or to introduce a second appellation. So you can see some examples, an example of the double appellation of the Thermopylae, which is supported by such an use of the mentioned phrasing. So if we remote from the maps all the occurrences of these phrasings, which introduce the information about a changing of name in the time, or of a second appellation, we can remove a certain number of toponyms, of Greek toponyms, from the map, and we can obtain, we can get a map which is a little more contrasted than the first one, but we still remark some red dots in the heart of Greece and Aegean Sea. So we have to consider that there is another reason to suspect a lack of familiarity from the audience about a toponym, not only the remoteness of the toponym, but also the smallness of the place. So on the toponyms, the red dots, which are concentrated in the Greek word, we can isolate quite a number of them, which concern very precise toponyms, like a reef, villages, like which are introduced as come, or for example the island of Psyttaleia between Salamis and the mainland, which is introduced not as a Nessos, as an island, but as a Nessis, an islet. So there is quite an insistence about Herodotus to show this smallness of the toponyms. So quickly, I will just present you another hypothesis which can explain why other toponyms are used here, are introduced by such phrasing, whereas they are not remote or particularly small. It is based, this last hypothesis is based on the observation that many toponyms introduced by these phrases present a certain ambiguity. They could be interpreted as common names rather than proper names. So it is the case for example, the Red Sea, the Hospitable Sea, the Black River, the City of Crocodiles, or the pitfall they call the Ant. This is only, I quote only a few of them, but if we consider not the occurrences, but the different toponyms, that are introduced at least once in the histories by one of these phrases, a small half of them presents such a case of ambiguity. And more strikingly, if we look at the ambiguous toponyms mentioned by Herodotus in the whole histories, with or without an introductory phrasing, more than a half of them are introduced by a phrase, by such a phrasing. So this is far beyond the general proportion, because in the histories, only 24% of the toponyms occur at least once with a phrasing. So this time it is easier to understand why an introductory phrasing is used in these cases of ambiguity. So it plays exactly the same role as our capital letters. So it ensures that the introduced toponym is understood as a toponym, despite the ambiguity it may present. This can help us to identify such toponyms. For example, I took the example of the Arabian and the Libyan mountain. When we examine the description of Egypt, and in particular, the one of the part of the country that narrows between two mountain ranges, one can notice a contrast between the ways Herodotus refers to the both mountains. Only the Libyan one has the Calamanian phrasing. This could be considered as not so relevant if it was not systematic. In the whole second book, each time the Arabian mountain occurs, it's without the participle Calamanian, whereas the Libyan Horus occurs only with it or with another formulation. So this participle Calamanian would be a clue to think that the Libyan mountain is a toponym and not a geographical indication, whereas there would be another status about the Arabian mountain. It would be a mountain of Araby. So we can contrast two types of appellation with a toponymic adjective. The one with without Calamanian or without a naming phrasing would only indicate. So you have here, for instance, the mountain of Taurus, the mountain of Armenia, the mountain of Matyana, and the Greek sea, whereas the two other would be real toponym. The Horus, the mountains, I'm sorry, which is called Libyan, so it's the name of the mountain, as well as the Sardinian is the name of the Sardinian Pelagos is the name of the sea, and not only geographical indication. So to conclude, and I'm sorry for being so long, the phrasing that introduce toponyms using the verb kaleo or the noun œnoma in the histories have all in common that they draw the audience's attention to the toponym rather than to the named place. The analysis of the different occurrences has allowed us to identify a number of different motives that may lead Herodotus to emphasize a toponym distinct from the place that bears it. First of all, he may seek to highlight it because he is about to make a comment on the name. It may be to disapprove of its choice. This is probably the case with the delta, but also to use it as a clue or as an argument supporting his point, as with the river Eridanus. with the various setting localities bearing the name of Cimmerians, or with the sanctuary of pharaoh Aphrodite in Egypt. He can also use it to tell an anecdote concerning not only the place, but more precisely the name of the toponym, the name of the place. So it's the case for the 9 roads, which is a locality the Persian army passes by in the 7th book, I guess. So the reason of the use of these phrasings may also be that there are several different names for the same place, contemporary or successive. So the phrase may then serve to introduce a second name, whether the first is expressly indicated, as in the case of Thermopylae, or not, which is the case of the example of Greece, which is often presented for 3 times presented in the histories as having changed her name, its name. The toponym may also be emphasized by Herodotus as the geographical equivalent of a technical term. Indeed, it can be deemed likely to be understood by the audience in the same way, because it refers to a place that is too specific or too distant. In such cases, there are 2 possibilities. Either the exclusionary effect of an unfamiliar term on the addressee should be mitigated by announcing and preventing this effect, or the effect should be used to emphasize the precision of the geographical descriptions. These interpretations may be operable according to the different passages of the histories. The first would be applied to the narrative passages, while the second would rather concern the geographical descriptions. And finally, the introductory phrase can play the role of a marker signaling the presence of a toponym when the status of the latter is ambiguous. On the other hand, it has not been possible to identify any specific examples of popular names among these toponyms, except possibly in the case of ambiguous toponyms. However, this absence could be explained by the fact that the question arises differently in the case of a corpus of toponyms rather than a technical text. There would be no question of popular names, but of toponyms that are more commonly used than others. In this case, the occurrence of double naming opposing a generally used term to a much more restricted local name, as for the Thermopylae, could correspond to this use, as well as the opposition between the first 2 attestations of the name of the delta, depending on the interpretation adopted. So finally, these phrases do not correspond exactly to our use of modern quotation marks, insofar as they are not sufficient on their own to introduce a distance from the term concerned, but they allow the term to be emphasized, so they would rather act as a kind of italics or capital letters.